Today, in our first video of 2024, on January the 2nd, we are starting with some praises, okay? I thought it was good to begin the year on a positive note. So the positive note for today is going to be aimed at Mythic Plus, because we have been getting through the first month and a half of this season, which is also the more trafficked, the more busy, the more played part of the season, the beginning. And what has been a very positive discovery in this first part of the season is this thing right here, is pointing out that in the first big, most important part of the season, the play rate, the participation of players in Season 3 of Dragonflight has been very high. This is quite unique to be able to see the participation of a season to be higher than the first season of an expansion. Usually the trend of an expansion is, of course, you start at the release of the expansion with the absolute peak of players, and then the player base starts declining more and more until you reach the first major patch of the season, where you have an influx, a surge of players, which is not going to reach the peak of the release of the expansion, and then the player base will keep dropping more and more until the release of the second season. There is going to be another surge of players, which is not going to be as high as the first major patch of the season, which wasn't as high as the release of the expansion, etc, etc. So to be able to see the release of this third season of Dragonflight, of Mythic Plus as well, to have more interest, to have the continued interest of the player base in Mythic Plus to be even as high, or at the very least even with the release of the expansion, is very good for the health of the game and perhaps for the future of Mythic Plus as well. This might be giving, let's just say, this might be giving hints for Blizzard towards what to do, how to shape Mythic Plus up for the next expansion. Because as we can see back from the graph of the participation of the players in Mythic Plus, while Season 2 was pretty meh, Season 2 was pretty average in terms of participation, Season 3 has spiked up again significantly compared to Season 2, but also compared to the release of the expansion. We can even tell this drop in play rate if we go and look at the currently logged characters, single unique characters in Mythic Plus right now in Season 3 being at 3 million, but when we go back to Season 2, it was at 2.3. So despite the entirety of Season 2 lasting for several months and Season 3 only being 7 weeks now long, the numbers have already been 30% higher than last season. Obviously, you have gotten many players pointing out their different thoughts and ideas as to why this has happened. Perhaps we might give credit to Season 3 for implementing from the start the positive additions that were put in Season 2 throughout the patch. For example, things like the crest system of Season 3, things like the added myth track to be able to upgrade your Great Vault and your early bosses in Mythic raiding were introduced weeks after the release of Season 2, while in Season 3 they were released from the beginning, from the get-go. Same goes perhaps for something like the Catalyst being added from week 1 in Season 3 compared to the previous seasons of this expansion, as well as the added catch-up mechanisms that were added 1 to 1.5 months into Season 2, which now in this new season have been available from the start. For example, being able to upgrade a piece of gear for no crest cost if you already own a piece of gear in the same slot at a higher item level. So looting a piece with terrible stats in the raid at 483 item level for your helmet would still allow you to loot any other helmet from Mythic Plus, from the Vault or from the raid, and upgrade it all the way up to 483 for free without having to spend crests. For example, this was added as an extra option from the start of this season. Then you have the other addition, or rather the other change, which was the Mythic Plus, of course, the Mythic Plus pool of dungeons. One of the major points, one of the major talk points of the beginning of this expansion was you are not getting all of the dungeons developed for this expansion at the same time for Mythic Plus. You had a reasonable chunk of the player base complaining about the fact that we are spending money for a product and Blizzard is withholding part of that content away from us. That's not fair. The angle Blizzard took for Mythic Plus was to only release 4 Dragonflight dungeons in Season 1, mixed with 4 old dungeons, and then Season 2 we got the other 4 Dragonflight dungeons with more older dungeons to be mixed in the pool of Mythic Plus, while this season we went completely rogue. This season we went exclusively for old dungeons and then the 2 Dawn of the Infinite mega dungeon added in this season. Maybe the extra influx of Mythic Plus might be due to the better dungeon pool. We have pointed out a few times the average difficulty of the dungeon this season being quite even and balanced, with only a couple of outliers that aren't even anywhere close to the difficulty level of previous dungeons. We're talking about Throne of the Tides and Murozond's Rise. Those are the only 2 dungeons slightly harder than the others when we go and look at the success rate, the difficulty in completing the dungeons in this season. But these numbers were still not nearly as bad as Season 1, for example, still with Thundering as the seasonal affix, or even Season 2. Many players have also reported the better feeling of now being more easily able to reach plus 20s, being able to more easily reach 2.5k rating in Mythic Plus, now that the dungeon scaling has gone even further up than previous seasons. So now doing a plus 20 is not nearly as challenging as it was before. So it pushes even more of the casual player base of Mythic Plus to stay more involved into Mythic Plus and having an extra goal that they otherwise would not have had in previous seasons. Perhaps in previous seasons they would have stopped short, maybe stopped at plus 15s, maybe even at 17s and 18s, whereas this time around in this season they can also try to push for the plus 20 for the portals of Mythic Plus, for example. That is another possible reason for this much better participation of the player base. Then you have the other point, of course, which is now visible very clearly here in our meta snapshot of the season, the comparison between Dragonflight Season 2 in terms of balancing compared to Dragonflight Season 3. You can clearly see here in the coefficient valuing the variety of the specs, the options in each role, how more strict the options were with the existence of Exodia. The moment you can very clearly see here, the moment 10.1.5 was introduced with the rework of the mages and the introduction of augmentation compared to Season 3. How much more varied the options are in Mythic Plus on pretty much all roles. You went from having only 1 healer available to having 3 different healers. You went from having 1 tank to having at least 2 tanks, and then you went from having 3 viable DPS to having 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 different DPS with a decent variance. In fact, to make this even more clear, the variety of healers at 383 is the best variety out of the entire expansion. We have never had a number so low so far when it comes to healers. So also from the variety, the variance and the options in terms of possible viable specs, it's also promoting more players to go into Mythic Plus, because of course you would be much more prone to get bored and sort of not really excited into getting in Mythic Plus if you were a healer in a season where 90% of the healers in high keys and high Mythic Plus pushers and streamers were all playing Holy Paladin, and you were just trying to play Mistweaver or Resto Druid or Priest compared to this season. Same goes for pretty much all the other roles. Having more options in the choices to play also gives more players more push, more drive, more incentive, more excitement in playing their spec in Mythic Plus compared to when you have a much more strict meta. So whether it was the better meta pushing more players to play, whether it was the easier dungeons coupled with the longer scaling of Mythic Plus keys making reaching plus 20 level much easier. If you look at here, for example, at the very start of the season, the very first month, 26s were the average high keys, whereas the first month of Season 2 it was 23s. whereas the first month, of course, of the release of the expansion, it was 21s. So we have gotten much higher up in the average keys being pushed, making it easier for the lower down levels to get through plus 20s. All this combined has made it much easier for players to get into Mythic Plus. Lastly, we have one more point. Maybe it wasn't the timing of the season, perhaps it wasn't the variance and the options in the specs available, maybe it wasn't even the dungeon pool or the difficulty of the dungeons. Maybe it was how easy and quick it can be for you to reroll. It can be for you to change from one spec to the next. Between the multiple ways, the multiple sets of activities for you to quickly gain gear, to quickly be of, let's say, Mythic Plus queuing up level or normal raid queuing up level, and then you add, of course, the quick and easy available catalyst to be able to get your set pieces of your tier set very early, and then you add to this the easy and quick fast upgrades, cheap upgrades for your armor if you have duplicates, if you loot multiple pieces in the same armor slot, together with, of course, the crafted items and the Great Vault, all together making it a faster effort for you to be able to switch to a different character. That might also be an incentive for you to play a different spec and continue to play in the season of Mythic Plus. This might also tie in having way more options now to play in Mythic Plus. You know, prior to this, if you wanted to reroll or respec as a healer, you pretty much only had one option, that was Holy. If you wanted to do so as a tank, you only had one option, that was Guardian, and if you wanted to do so as a melee DPS, you had no option because there were no melee DPS available in Season 2. Now though, it's more varied. Now you can choose between 1, 2, 3, 4 different range specs as a DPS. You can even choose between 1, 2, 3 melee DPS specs, for example, in Mythic Plus if you want to reroll, if you want to try something else. So there is more incentive, there is more freedom for you to try out a different spec, and at the same time now it's also faster. It's not nearly as much of a grind, it's not nearly as boring as it was before. There are still, no doubt, we don't have to just praise Blizzard, we can still complain a little bit. There are some problems, for example, Flightstones. Even though it's true, you get to upgrade your stuff for free if you gain a bunch of upgrades, it's also true that Flightstones can start costing quite a lot, especially on your alts, especially when you don't start having already 2,000 Flightstones capped already, and you have to start doing all of the story chapters left and right, the side quests left and right, just to farm some of these Flightstones to be able to have enough to constantly upgrade your gear as an alt character, as an under-geared character who is in constant need of upgrades. So for our complaint corner, we have one complaint right there. Perhaps speeding up the acquisition of Flightstones, especially on alt characters. But besides that, we can now clearly see how much more effective and engaging this season of Mythic Plus has been. Now, with this, as pointed out, it might be a good way for Blizzard to pick up some tips, some hints on what they want to do in the next expansion. Right? Maybe they can take this as a message, as a prototype for the next expansion. Like, for example, let's start the next expansion with the Catalyst Open from week 1. Now that we learned the good reception of this feature in this season of Dragonflight, we might as well have this available at the beginning of the next expansion as well. What about the addition of the gear that is upgradable at no cost? If you already have a higher item level piece in that slot, that's also a very good way to allow you to quickly upgrade some pieces that could be upgrades in terms of secondary stats, for example, or maybe leech, or maybe sockets, etc, etc. That's also a good idea. Keeping this crest system as well as this multi-upgrade track system, together with having an upgrade system for your Great Vault Mythic Plus gear, as well as the entry-level raid bosses, to keep those rewards still valuable deeper into the season instead of becoming more obsolete. All these things, I think, are great takes for the beginning of the next expansion. Perhaps also the rotating dungeons, the rotating new expansion dungeons, since we already have the announcement that in the War Within expansion we're gonna get once more 8 brand new dungeons. They might also go for the same route we went this expansion. So we get the first 4 with 4 old dungeons to make up the first season of Mythic Plus, and then the following 4 new dungeons with 4 more older dungeons to make up the dungeon pool of Mythic Plus, same as we had in Dragonflight. Perhaps the only thing worth keeping an eye out on when it comes to tips that we have been able to test in this expansion for the next expansion's Mythic Plus seasons would be to perhaps keep an eye out on for some of these affixes, in particular the newly added Afflicted and Incorporeal. Come up with a few more ways for a few more classes and specs to be able to deal with these affixes, for example. That could be something worth keeping an eye out on from a Blizzard perspective when thinking about the next expansion's Mythic Plus seasons. But for today, this was a good recap on the, for now, very good state of Mythic Plus in this 3rd season, proving to be still quite highly engaging for many players, despite what could have been predictable. You know, predicting that Season 1 would have been the most popular, and then Season 2 would have been the second most popular, and then Season 3 would have been the least popular as it was the last one of the expansion. Instead, we have gotten the surprise turnover of this 3rd season being quite engaging for the majority of the player base when it comes to Mythic Plus. So this was the take for today's video on this first video of 2024. I hope you have all been having a good New Year's, some nice celebrations, and of course many New Year's resolutions, which you will already be dropping by next week. So for today, we are now leaving each other on this Tuesday, I believe. We are starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, which can also be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as, of course, subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I have at least 3 or 4 resolutions for 2024, and I think I can keep on to at least one of them. That would be a win.